Spirit of Thersites here, kicking ass, taking names, and handing out certificates of shame. On my History channel, I have frequently observed that the United States is in the midst of a legitimacy crisis. Many observers have lamented the state of affairs, bemoaning the gullibility of people who have fallen prey to conspiracy theories or question the outcome of elections. This legitimacy crisis is partly rooted in the vague impression that things have gone awry, and this impression can and has been stoked by misinformation. However, an uncomfortable truth that few public thinkers are willing to confront is that people have lost faith in the American government precisely because it does not represent the interests of the people and does not do much else besides funnel money to corporations. In this series, I will examine and tier rank all national officials from all 50 states according to how well they advance the general welfare of their state and the nation as a whole. No legitimacy crisis operates without personnel, who sully the whole operation. So we will go state by state and look at every governor, lieutenant governor, U.S. senator, and member of the House of Representatives. Many people report hating Congress but liking their congressperson. Here we will test the rationality of such a position and almost certainly slaughter a sacred cow or two. Before delving into the dishonor roll of each state, I will consider the broader socio-political conditions in the state in question. Knowing how people make their living, the partisan breakdown, and which companies and billionaires run a state can tell you a great deal about why certain politicians behave the way that they do. Make no mistake about it, however, understanding why a politician is terrible does not excuse them for being terrible, and I have never been one for curbing grades or suffering corruption. My own views are unapologetically leftist and centered around class concerns. If you find yourself bristling at one of my comments or ratings, please know that I take the same amount of responsibility for my words as American politicians do for their actions. None. Now, let's talk about conditions in Kentucky broadly, and then we'll look at the interesting group of people who represent the state. We'll look at 6 congresspeople, 2 senators, governor and lieutenant governor. So we have 10 people on the docket. So Kentucky is one of the 5 poorest states per capita. The poverty rate is 18.3%. So it is right up there with states such as Mississippi. Company that you just never want to keep, no offense, Mississippi. The inequality in Kentucky is so bad if you look at the difference in wealth between this area, known as Central Kentucky, although it's pretty far north and it's to the east of the center, but it's called Central Kentucky even though it really isn't. If you look at the difference between the people there who have all the money in the state and the very poor people who live especially in the eastern counties and also in some of the western counties, Kentucky actually has inequality comparable to the country of Mexico. And that's actually pretty incredible. Even in the very poor states of the Deep South, I'm not sure if their inequality is quite that extreme, because a lot of their wealthier people don't have the same level of wealth as the wealthy of Kentucky. In Kentucky, the major way that people make their living is through working in retail and fast food. That is how people make a living. It is very much a service economy at this point. Naturally, the biggest employer in the state is Yum Brands writ large, that being the company which holds KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, the Holy Trinity, if you will. Texas Roadhouse is way higher on the list than you would expect. I haven't been to a lot of the rural parts of Kentucky, but the only way it can be that high is if pretty much every county you see on the map here has 1 or 2 Texas Roadhouses. I didn't realize it was quite that popular. I know it is pretty popular in Lexington, though. And by the way, I used to live in Lexington for 4 years between 2009 and 2013, so this is a state that I'm pretty familiar with. I briefly dated a girl who lived in Louisville, so I've been there on several occasions. Of course, I've been in the area between, and I also took a trip with a friend to eastern Kentucky to the city of Jackson to see where the Steven Seagal masterpiece from 1997 was filmed. I'm trying to think. Fire Down Below. That's the name of the movie. We went to investigate the town where they filmed it. I assume it's in Jackson County, which is right here. I don't know for sure, though. At any rate, what I found interesting about Jackson in particular is that despite being a very small, very poor town, when we went to the local library, even though it was very small, it was actually well stocked. And that's another weird thing I noticed about Kentucky, because it is the oddest place I've ever been. And I've been around a lot of the country at this point. Kentuckians, despite being poor on average, I would say in general they're probably better read than the average American. There actually are a fair number of reasonably intelligent, thoughtful people in Kentucky, more than you would think. The other thing I noticed is that outside of Louisville, Kentuckians tend to be rather introverted to the point of being clannish. It's actually not easy to make friends in Kentucky unless you're from there. And that even includes if you move to one of the cities like Lexington. And because of that social dynamic, people in Kentucky can be a bit evasive at times. They are very guarded. So I imagine that if you are doing political polling, for instance, it's probably harder than in most other states because people are very guarded about expressing their opinions to strangers. That is called Kentucky politeness by other people who have moved there and lived there for a while and been a bit weirded out by it. And it's to the point where, and you can ask Sean about this when we're doing live streams on Thersites the Historian, it is to the point where there are friend groups of people who are from any other place in the country or world, and then friend groups that are all Kentucky, and there is very little overlap between those two groups. Even in Lexington, which is, a relatively prosperous, cultured place. The urban-rural divide in Kentucky is pretty extreme as well in terms of the cultural difference, and between the cities there's also a good deal of difference. Covington in the north has become fairly major. It is effectively a major suburb of Cincinnati, and the people there don't have a southern accent at all. In fact, they have a more aggressive northern-sounding accent than most people in places like Minnesota, and I'm not kidding about that, at least in my experience. I had a student from Covington who I would have sworn that she was from somewhere near the Canadian border. It's an odd thing. I'm not sure why it is the case. Louisville, they self-identify as weird, but they're really not. Louisville's actually probably the most normal place socially. The people there, a lot of the things I said earlier don't really apply to Louisville. It's actually very socially normal. The difference between Louisville and the rest of Kentucky is that the people there tend to be more outgoing. Tattoos are common, a lot of counterculture kind of stuff, a lot of independent restaurants. It's a really cool city, actually, and it has very little in common with the rest of the state. I like to think of it as the independent city-state of Louisville. It also has very little in common with Indiana, which is the other state that it borders, and it serves as kind of an urban center for a lot of people in southern Indiana. Frankfort is an odd place. It is a very small city, despite appearing prominent on the map because it's a state capital. And in many ways, it closes at 5 o'clock, so I like to think of it as the day capital. Most people who work in Frankfort come in from either Lexington or Louisville. Not all that many people actually live in Frankfort. Very odd. They do have some distilleries in Frankfort. The recent show on Netflix, Heist, one of the episodes is set in Frankfort at the Maker's Mark facility, where the protagonist is a guy who was pilfering bottles from his employers and selling them to mostly rich people who were trying to host politicians. When he got busted after a bunch of cases of some 20-year pappy went missing, they knew someone else did it, but the sheriff was eager to gain political cred and throw this guy in jail. So because they'd already offered that guy immunity to testify, they didn't go after the real culprit, and they framed him. Although he had stolen a ton of liquor, he actually had not touched that one particular item that made the news. Anyway, it's sort of just emblematic of how accountability in America works these days, and sort of the neoliberal passing of the buck. Because no one went after Maker's Mark itself, or at least critiqued them or refused to prosecute, because they had no security in place, and all of their employees were stealing stuff. This was a widespread cultural thing there. They did nothing about it. No one critiqued them for that, but instead went after the workers. And of course, there was no accountability for the lobbyists who were buying $1,000 bottles of liquor to try to literally liquor up and win over Kentucky lawmakers. I imagine many of the people we'll talk about on the list have been to such events, since many of them had a past in state government and still keep in touch with the bigwigs at the state level, as most national politicians do. Lexington is probably, for its size, one of the more conservative cities I've ever been to. Usually a city its size is pretty solidly blue, at least in today's world of hyper-partisanship. Lexington is pretty much 50-50, but it's very much... I would say, if anything, Lexington is sort of a living symbol of neoliberalism. Let me explain. So, Lexington is extremely pro-gay. There are probably as many gay bars there as straight bars, and I'm not kidding about that. And the gay bars are probably of higher quality from what little I've seen. Lexington also is super pro-banker. Bankers control the city. Everything there is controlled by either bankers or horse people. So it has sort of an aristocratic vibe a little bit, but mostly it is controlled by financiers. Financiers happen to be socially liberal, but economically hyper-conservative, and when we meet the congressman from this district, he actually embodies that, as he is probably the biggest Wall Street whore in the entire state. And this is a state that has Mitch McConnell, so I want you to think about that. Anyway, I never liked Lexington very much, not a great place, but I understand why it is the way that it is, and why it is basically a gay mecca. When I traveled to the rest of the state, because oftentimes I would travel south along I-75 through Tennessee and then on I-40 to visit my family in North Carolina, I would go through some rural areas in Kentucky, so I got to see some of the other people of the state. And by and large, I have to say that rural Kentucky very much is racist and homophobic. It's become a bit of a trope to just assume that large swaths of the country are racist, sexist, and xenophobic. It just became a trope after 2016 when people were trying to look for reasons why Trump won, especially a lot of my friends in the history department who have never been in the red district in their life, who just look at any place that's a little red and assume everyone there has to be all three of the fatal sins. In reality, most people rarely complete the trio. I haven't met too many people who are all three. There are a lot of people who are one or two. And actually, at least in my experience, and again, I would never face sexism since I'm a dude, I don't really get the impression that Kentucky is particularly sexist. So it's got that going for it, but it is certainly very homophobic and pretty racist as well, although more homophobic than racist if I had to choose one. And that's odd because for the most part, the South, at least say North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, a lot of places like that have largely caught up on gay issues. Kentucky definitely hasn't. And that's why so many gay people flock to Lexington. They're getting away from areas where they can never really be accepted because the people there are homophobic. And one of the signs of that is that there's a rampant rumor that's been going around for years that Mitch McConnell is gay. And that is why a lot of people justify not liking him. And the reason why they say he's gay also shows that Kentuckians can be pretty racist, especially in rural areas, is that by marrying an Asian woman, he was trying to get the closest thing to a man. I'm not making this up. This is what people in rural Kentucky actually believe. So anyway, with all that out of the way, let's see how the people of Kentucky are represented. Are they represented well? Not really. Although they do have some interesting people who represent them. I do have to give Kentucky that. For a place where not all that many people outside of Louisville have a lot of charisma, Kentucky has managed to elect some people who are fairly big personalities, or at least prominent in some ways. So, up first, representing the state of Kentucky, is current Governor Andy Beshear. And these actually ended up loading in the exact opposite order of what I wanted, but I can work with that. Andy Beshear is the son of former Governor Steve Beshear, and he is the 63rd governor of the state. Steve Beshear, by the way, was the 61st governor, and he was in office when I was there. Steve Beshear is sort of the poster child of Southern Democrats. He was fairly conservative, and also conservative to the point that it was actually Steve Beshear who greenlit the Creation Museum and the Noah's Ark exhibit for Ken Ham. Two projects that were two tax break programs which were carried over by his successor, Republican Governor Matt Bevin. But Andy Beshear is actually a fair amount different than his dad, which I find surprising, because normally the reason why the Democrats, especially in red states, turn to, I guess what you might call brand name politicians, is because they know that these people are reliably pro-corporate. But actually with Andy Beshear, there's not a ton of evidence that he is. He actually might be somewhat genuine. He was elected Attorney General in 2015, and he sued Matt Bevin on several occasions. Won at least one case in 2019, or he won the gubernatorial race against Bevin in 2019 after they formed their rivalry. Just like many people who have the money to go to college, he decided not to go in his home state, but instead to go elsewhere. He went to Vanderbilt for his undergrad, then went to UVA for law school. He started out on a pretty negative trajectory, sort of like his father. He ended up repping the developers of the Bluegrass Pipeline, so it looked like he was going to be another right-wing Democrat. And over time, though, he has turned more to the left, or at least to sort of the center-left. As Attorney General, he did manage to save teacher pensions from Matt Bevin, which is a pretty big deal. Matt Bevin was one of the more aggressive governors in trying to go after state employees, trying to cut teacher salaries, trying to bust state unions. And Bevin managed to blow his credibility in a state which elected a whole hell of a lot of Tea Partiers not many years before Bevin got elected in 2015. So Bevin effectively killed the Tea Party movement in Kentucky once and for all. And also, another interesting thing about Kentucky that Beshear helps to represent and help to resuscitate is that Kentucky was one of the holdouts from when the South went Republican, in the sense that it remained Democratic at the state level. Because even though the state had been voting Republican on a national level for years, Democrats retained control pretty steadily until 2010 when they got wiped out. But because of Bevin really fucking up and then Andy Beshear managing to take him out, Kentucky has once again reverted to being blue at the local level. So, interesting dynamic there. It is, again, a very odd and interesting place and somewhat out of step with the rest of the country. As governor so far, he hasn't really done all that much. As Attorney General, he was more successful, at least in my opinion. He filed 9 different lawsuits against pharma companies for the opioid epidemic, which, just like in most of rural America, has been pretty terrible for Kentucky. And so Andy Beshear fought on behalf of Kentuckians. When he ran for governor, he ran on Medicaid expansion, he ran on education funding, and he ran on protecting pensions, which, given his record as Attorney General, it's safe to say that he is capable of doing those things. He ran on the promise of higher teacher pay, clean coal. Like I said, he might have turned left vis-a-vis his father, but he's definitely not a liberal. Also, clean coal is an oxymoron. It does not exist. The only people who believe in it are people who engage in wishful thinking or are scientifically illiterate or simply are lying to you. In the case of Andy Beshear, I think he's clearly lying about clean coal. No one in 2021 is stupid enough to believe that's a thing. He also relaunched a state health care exchange. He's against right-to-work legislation, and he is in favor of fixing the bridge between Cincinnati and Covington. Also, this was a place where Obama famously gave a speech talking about the need for infrastructure spending. That bridge has been in poor repair for years, and every single day, people going to work to and from Covington and Cincinnati get stuck in traffic, often for hours at a time. It is a major issue, and I'm glad that Beshear is on it. As governor, he was responsive to COVID. Took a lot of flack over it because, as you can imagine, being a mostly red state, Kentucky was not super thrilled with masks or vaccines. So Beshear did incur some unpopularity, but he did keep rates of infection lower than they otherwise would have been. Although, again, I mean, it's Kentucky, and most of the people there have contempt for the idea of masks, so still pretty bad. He is in favor of bipartisanship, TM. He also wants to build a new bridge to Indiana. He wants to use gambling revenue to pay state pensions. And he has pointed out that right now only 50-something% of the obligation on state pensions is available. So by legalizing and then taxing gambling, he hopes to close the gap. This is one case where I don't know if Kentucky can get a better governor than this, even though this guy's not that special. Another thing he's got going for him that I forgot to put in my notes, but I remember from a previous video, is that Andy Beshear has stopped the state teat to Ken Ham. So Ken Ham will get no further funding beyond his existing contracts from the state of Kentucky. His Creation Museum and Noah's Ark exhibit have been financial failures, and if not for the largesse of a state that can't afford to help him, Ken Ham's projects would have never launched and would have failed early. So kudos to Andy Beshear for having the balls to stand up to Ken Ham. I'm actually going to give Andy Beshear a C. He is okay. I mean, he's doing kind of the least here. It's not terrible, but it's not anything impressive. I don't think he will really fix too many of Kentucky's problems. He will just kind of nip at the edges of a couple of things, keep pensions safe for one term or two, but fundamental issues won't really be resolved, and the problems that face Kentucky citizens, including rampant inequality and massive unemployment in the East that has never been resolved since the decline of the coal mining industry, all of those things will remain in place. And by the way, I forgot to mention it earlier when I was talking about the state, but yes, while Eastern Kentucky does have a reputation as a coal mining area, that has not really been true for years. There are only a handful of places where coal is still mined. It used to be a vibrant industry, but as of 2017, there are only 4,000 coal miners in all of Kentucky. That does not stop people who are politically active in Frankfort and Lexington from driving around with stickers about how important coal is to Kentucky's economy and to Kentucky workers. But those people are fundamentally full of shit because the proof is in the numbers. There aren't that many people who make money from coal in Kentucky at present time. So, there you go. The Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky and Andy Beshear's running mate is Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman. Jacqueline is the youngest person we will cover on this list. She's 39 years old. And by the standards of American politics, she qualifies as attractive by virtue of not being near death. She went to Centre College and studied history. She then got her master's in political science at the University of Louisville. Currently, she is enrolled in a PhD program in education at the University of Kentucky, so she has been all around the state pretty much. Centre College is in Centerville, if I'm not mistaken. It's a nice little college town, kind of off to itself. She was a high school teacher and girls basketball coach for 10 years. She had a pretty good record. Actually, I think she had 2 more wins than losses, but her sort of political selling point is that she had a good record and she was a really good coach. I mean, maybe her students liked her, I don't know. But, basketball-wise, she was okay-ish. She wasn't Greg Popovich. She tried and failed during the 2010s to run for a Kentucky House seat. She then emerged, however, as an education policy reform advocate and used her position as a teacher to bolster her credibility on that issue. She was an assistant principal from 2017 to 19. And somehow she became just prominent enough to gain Andy Beshear's attention. and he put her on the ballot as his lieutenant governor. But she is so focused on education issues that her stipulation for joining the ticket is that not only would she be lieutenant governor, but she would also be the Secretary of Education. So Jacqueline Coleman is not only lieutenant governor, but Secretary of Education. And as I mentioned, she also is a PhD student. And if that's not enough, she also has 3 children, 2 of them by adoption, and 1 of them is a newborn. I know that it might come across as sexist to say that she has taken on too much, but she has taken on too much. That's way too many responsibilities to do adequately. This is too much. This is overreach. This is putting ambition before sense. This makes very little sense. She's actually the first lieutenant governor and most senior Kentucky official to give birth. So, I guess that's pretty neat. It's not that important really, but it's just kind of a fun factoid, something that she can hang her hat on Twitter. 2 of her kids, actually wait, she's got 4 kids. 2 of her kids are from her husband's first marriage. Another is an ex-student whom she befriended and felt sorry for, who was in a bad situation, so Coleman adopted the child, and then she has a newborn as well, as I mentioned. As Secretary of Education, she wants to help members see a, quote, 30,000-foot view of politics, and she wants to get teachers more engaged in making education policy, which I think is an admirable goal. But again, I think she is stretching herself too thin. And also, it's a little vague exactly what she wants to do. I assume she agrees with Governor Beshear about increasing teacher pay and things of that nature, protecting teachers' unions. She strikes me as someone who probably intends well, but maybe doesn't know how to strategize to use her energy effectively. So I don't think she'll end up going very far. I wouldn't be surprised if she gets nominated by the Democrats to run for a Senate seat in the next 10 years, or run in a House district, or something of that nature, or even they try to put her up as governor. She might even win one of those things. But I see her as someone who is probably limited in terms of her ability to get things done, because she has a tendency to be vague, and she very much strikes me as the person who has more passion than knowledge. That being said, I don't see any reason to think that she's corrupt at all. Her donations are very modest and don't come from any sources that you wouldn't expect. She basically is a teacher representing teachers. And because of that, I think she actually is conducive to positive legitimacy. Because we're rating them on legitimacy, Jacqueline Coleman is actually an A until proven otherwise. But again, like I said, I don't think she's going to actually achieve much, and I don't think she'll go that far in politics. But in a country where corruption is the norm and most people are there for the money, so far at least, Jacqueline Coleman seems to be what she says she is. I have a feeling that she will disappoint us, but we have to vote. We have to base this on what people have said and done up to this point, not what might happen. Up next is man-turtle hybrid, senior senator of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell. We knew he was coming. I probably even put him as the thumbnail. I don't know, since I don't set thumbnails until the video is already uploaded. But maybe I put his face as the thumbnail just to kind of try to win over some horror fans to this channel. Mitch McConnell, all of you know him, so I'm not exactly sure what I can say that you won't already know. He is one of the best-known senators in America, arguably the most powerful, or at least he was right up until January 6th when he had a falling out with Donald Trump. At this point, Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, and maybe Bernie Sanders actually seem to be the top dogs in the Senate. But right up until January 6th, McConnell had been the man since about 2010, and there's not any compelling reason why he couldn't resume that role going forward. McConnell is an absolute master of partisanship and obstructionism. If anything, he might be the most successful obstructionist in American history. His strategy of just say no was not borrowed from Nancy Reagan, but rather he was in the Senate in the early 2000s, and when George Bush won re-election in 2004, McConnell came away with the impression that the decisive element was that Bush got a few things on his domestic agenda passed, namely Medicare Part D and No Child Left Behind, both of which actually could have been programs promoted by Clinton-style Democrats. So in many ways, Bush kind of stole the thunder from the Democrats and took credit for things that they might have tried to do on their own, while also appearing to be successful on both domestic and foreign policy. I mean, the main thing going against him in the 2004 election is that the Iraq War was starting to go sour and there was still no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. So McConnell's analysis is that it was those two fairly small domestic achievements which put him over the edge and gave him the appearance of effectiveness that he needed. And McConnell just took that as evidence that you have to stop the incumbent president from getting stuff done if you want to keep them from getting elected. As I've stated before, I think that his analysis is mostly correct. If you want to justify a second term, you can't just run on a pie-in-the-sky agenda. You have to have some proof that you have been successful in the past at getting things done. You have to have credibility. People have to believe that you are capable of doing the things that you say you're going to do. So McConnell's goal is to just prevent Democrats from doing anything. And for the most part, he's been pretty damn successful at doing just that. And we also live in an era, of course, where Democrats don't really try to do that much. There aren't too many bold initiatives to begin with, just a lot of milquetoast tweaking, and even that Mitch McConnell won't have. McConnell also, I think, is mostly responsible for the debt ceiling crises that we faced in the Obama years, where Republicans literally threatened to shut down the government, in some cases did shut down the government, calling for, in theory, budget cuts to curb the growth of the deficit and debt, but in reality, they just wanted to sneak in a bunch of tax breaks. If you read the fine print, that's what they did. They snuck in tax breaks for the corporate donors, and it was a lot of political grandstanding. But unlike one of the grandstanders we'll cover in this episode, Mitch McConnell, when he grandstands, you should be scared because he knows exactly what he's doing and he usually gets his way. He's very unpopular at home, as I mentioned. There have been rampant rumors across Kentucky for decades since he became a senator in the 80s that Mitch McConnell is in fact gay because his wife is Asian. Of course, that is a completely stupid theory, and of all the many reasons to hate McConnell, that is the least compelling. As Sean has mentioned before on previous live streams, Mitch McConnell is one of the few people in the world who self-identifies as a bad guy and loves it when people give him negative publicity. Going into almost every election of his political career, he has had an underwater approval rating, and he is one of the least popular senators in America with his own constituents, but he always manages to win. The reason he manages to win is because he always goes negative, and he makes the people he's running against look worse than him. He can also tout bringing home some bacon. For him, I think it's almost a game of brinksmanship with voters. He knows that they hate him, and he loves it. But he wants to make sure that they feel like they have no choice but to vote for him. And so, he gets elected. And he does that remarkably well. His last opponent, of course, was Amy McGrath, the retired Marine pilot, who has no charisma and ran as a very, very, very watered-down Democrat who's indistinguishable from a Republican, a strategy which has not yielded results yet in Kentucky. After over a decade of that being the official, brilliant, Ivy League-approved strategy, it has yet to yield any results at all. So, yeah, keep plugging away with Amy McGrath. So anyway, McConnell is one of the most corrupt people in Congress. He raises tons and tons of money from corporate America. This is how he's able to run so many negative ads. He is for sale for every industry in America. I didn't even bother looking up his specific donors. There are a lot. He's also independently wealthy, and he's one of the wealthiest men in the Senate. And the Senate is a very rich body of men. When he ran against Steve Beshear in 1996 to defend his Senate seat, McConnell ran an ad, "Don't be Besheared," with images of sheep getting sheared. And he's run similar little smart-ass ads about every opponent he's faced. He's just as smarmy as he looks. McConnell is a piece of shit. I do have to disagree with the people who think that getting rid of McConnell will end obstructionism. His successor would be a little less able of an obstructionist, but still, the strategy can be done by anybody. McConnell does it without a shred of charisma. So someone else might have less brain power than McConnell, who, say what you will about him, is a very smart man. But they would have more charisma, so it would even out, and they could probably still get it done. At least most of the time. They might step in it once in a while and get outmaneuvered, but anyway, McConnell, I mean, he's got to be an F. McConnell makes politics more negative. He tries to undermine the credibility of the opposition in ways that are underhanded. McConnell is corrupt in a way that's pretty open. He obstructs legislation and so obstructs the will of the people in ways that are unprecedented. He engages in partisanship on a level that is completely beyond the pale. He helps to drive partisanship with his every action, both in D.C. and at home. McConnell is shameless in the way that he tries to pack the courts. I mean, there's no redeeming quality to this man. This man is a public menace. I assume he has no friends, and I hope that he dies a miserable and very painful death, preferably of a long-term illness that is deeply painful, and for which there is no relief. Fuck you, Mitch. Also, interesting side note, he is from Louisville, but everyone in Louisville hates his guts. Louisville is a pretty blue city, and I don't know if they really hate Republicans in general, but they really fucking hate Mitch McConnell. So he's basically persona non grata in his own hometown. Everyone there absolutely fucking hates him. And my ex-girlfriend, who is from Louisville, once said, Mitch McConnell is the leading cause of vaginal dryness in America. I'll leave you with that thought on McConnell. Next up is Senator Rand Paul, the junior senator from Kentucky, and Mitch McConnell's colleague in the Senate. Rand Paul is one of the few people that I mentioned earlier who's actually fairly interesting. His views are kind of all over the place, but to me that makes him more interesting. I really hate party line, partisan hack types. Those people are extraordinarily boring in addition to being deeply damaging. Rand Paul is, of course, the son of Ron Paul, and from a libertarian perspective, I've heard many people basically call him a step down, kind of a poor man's version of Ron Paul. I think that's basically accurate. Although, in some cases, Rand Paul actually comes across as a slightly better politician. That being said, he's not actually that great of a politician, and there are multiple instances of him really stepping in big piles of shit and making himself look foolish. Again, as I mentioned, he has some libertarian leanings, although he's not, strictly speaking, libertarian. He will toe the party line when needed, but one area where he often disagrees with the party is on foreign intervention. So sometimes he does work with people on the left, with some Democrats who are anti-war. And because of that reason, I think that if you asked Democrats in the country who follow politics, Rand Paul is probably the most popular Republican among Democrats because of the rare stands that he makes on foreign policy and also sometimes on civil liberties as well. Rand Paul was part of the 2010 Tea Party wave. He was helped out immensely by the fact that his incompetent opponent, Jack Conway, was talked into running an ad that he clearly did not support or feel comfortable with, where they took a story from Rand Paul's college days about him talking about Aqua Buddha, which was clearly some sort of joke, and they tried to pretend that Rand Paul was not really a Christian. They basically tried to religion shame him in a general election. And the thing is, you can't really, as a Democrat, religion shame Republicans because the religious vote tends to go Republican. It doesn't really work. And Aqua Buddha, because of how ridiculous it sounds, just isn't, it's not convincing that Rand Paul secretly worships an Aqua Buddha. That just doesn't work as an attack. But that's what Jack Conway's campaign ran with. And it was extremely frustrating to watch that back in the day. Especially when they brought Jack Conway on the news to try to defend his talking point. And you could tell just by his face that it was painful. That he really didn't want to be there. That he didn't believe a word he was saying. He wanted to end the interview. He was regretting the decision to greenlight this idiotic ad. He was probably about to go rip the head off of whoever suggested it. So anyway, Rand Paul got in on the Tea Party wave, and largely due to the ineptitude of his opponent, who by the way actually had a really good record as Attorney General, and then fucked it all up with Aqua Buddha. That's got to be one of the dumbest things I've ever witnessed in politics. Rand Paul actually only voted with Trump 70% of the time, which in today's Senate actually means he's one of the more independent voters. It used to be that there were a lot of voters who were on the 50% mark. Now at 70%, Rand Paul is a true maverick. Remember, John McCain was considered a maverick, and he voted with Trump and also Bush 90-something% of the time. Yeah, maverick. I mean, Rand Paul, if anything, is much more deserving of the name than John McCain was. Even though he is more anti-interventionist than most Republicans and also most Democrats, Rand Paul is not as consistent on that point as his father, something that he's gotten a lot of hits from libertarians on. He is very critical of our alliance with Saudi Arabia, and he frequently butts heads with neocons such as Lindsey Graham. I believe that they hate each other from what I understand. And because he likes to get into fights with neocons and he recognizes that Saudi Arabia sucks, I have to give him some props for that. He also blames quagmires in Syria and Iran more on the Iraq War than Obama, although, of course, as a Republican, he frequently denounced Obama, called him a socialist, did some other dumb shit, but at least he, on foreign policy, he does acknowledge that the problems did not start when Obama took office in 2009. Obama might have exacerbated and continued those policies, but he was not the originator. So, once again, credit for being able to see beyond a partisan lens. Were Rand Paul named Mitch McConnell, he would simply pretend that every problem in the world was caused by the other side and move on with his life. When it comes to some other issues, however, one other issue where he is pretty good, he's against militarized police. Now, he said some hypocritical things during the BLM marches in the summer. He was kind of all over the place on that, on whether the police should crack down, but also militarized police is bad. We have civil liberties, but maybe not these civil liberties. So, with Rand Paul, one of his problems is that he is very hypocritical and very inconsistent with this, when you try to extrapolate from his stances. So he's a man who has principles, but those principles often conflict with his partisan affiliation in ways that are uncomfortable, and we'll come back to why that might be the case in a minute. But now to talk about some issues where he also took a strong principled stand but came across as a complete asshole. And this is why, despite having presidential aspirations, Rand Paul will never come close. So, when hate crime bills were being passed, I think this was early in his Senate term, Rand Paul came out strongly against them, saying that they were prejudicial. He just looked like a complete asshole when he did that. And usually, as I said, he is willing to call out his own party when they're wrong. But when it came to trying to investigate January 6th, Rand Paul was one of the loudest voices against investigating January 6th. And basically said that Trump did nothing wrong and everything is peachy keen. So, Rand can try to be slippery and try to be a typical politician at times, which is always disappointing because it's intermixed with random stands that are principled. But when he does try to be a politician in the traditional sense, he's somehow more insufferable than the people who are always terrible. I don't know why that is. But you can tell when he's faking it. to the point that it's painful to watch. I mean, this man, his natural political talent is very, very limited. So he's not smooth with that at all. So let's see where Rand gets his money. Oh, wait, what else did he do? Oh, so when it came to vaccines, Rand Paul, as an ophthalmologist, was seen as more of an expert than most Congress people, even though, of course, ophthalmology makes him an eye surgeon. So it's not directly related, but still he's got more medical background than most of the lawyers in Congress. So people looked to him for expertise on some level, and he was all over the damn place about vaccines. And also on masks and shutdowns. He was mostly against them, which I guess is predictable given that he's a libertarian, but in a way that was kind of, again, a little watery and vague. He took money. Let's see, who does he take money from? Let's talk about Rand Paul's donors, because this will explain sometimes why he's a little bit on the fence. One area where Rand Paul never critiques his party is on matters of finance and economics. Most of his financial contributions come from financial interest, banks, lobbyists, etc. He also gets money from conservative groups. No surprise there, and most ideologically charged members of Congress can say the same, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. Another major donor for him is the healthcare industry. Rand Paul has adamantly been against the ACA since its inception, and he has also been opposed to anything resembling Medicare for All or any expansion of Medicare or Medicaid. He gets his money from the healthcare industry, so it might be because he's a principled libertarian. It might also be because that's where his bread is buttered, or maybe both. Maybe they reinforce each other, which is kind of what I think happens in the case of Rand Paul. He also gets a lot of money from real estate interest and securities. So Rand Paul is the kind of guy who is not a big fan of affordable housing. He gets his money from real estate agents. I'm not saying he's corrupt, but he's not as pure as he wants you to think, is what I'm saying. And sadly, he's still less corrupt than most, which is a sad state of affairs, since given where he gets his money from and how his positions line up with those donors completely, yeah, I don't know. That's a sad thing, isn't it, that Rand Paul is less corrupt than most. Also, another interesting thing about Rand Paul, and something that makes me... I'm going to have to take him down a whole letter for this. Rand Paul is a physical coward in a way that is embarrassing. As a member of the American elite, he does not face actual danger hardly ever. Yet Rand Paul on several occasions has demonstrated an irrational fear of encountering people in a confrontation. Most people are well adjusted enough to know that nothing will really happen except Rand Paul. And part of that, I assume, is because he came up sheltered and he read a lot of Ayn Rand and he thinks that he can run his mouth as much as he wants without repercussions, and that illusion was shattered just one time. Early in his tenure in the Senate, I think I was still living in Kentucky at the time, he got into a dispute with a neighbor over leaves. I don't remember who put leaves on the other's property, but there was an exchange of words. And Rand Paul, who is a slightly built, short fellow, went over to a man who was deep in a midlife crisis and probably had some substance abuse issues and shook his hand at him and really just talked down to him and basically was a male Karen. This guy sort of started to think about it, and it started to eat away at him that, this member of the state elite had talked down to him in this way. And this guy also is very wealthy, by the way. So probably the type of Kentuckian who owns a horse or two and sees himself as a lord and master of his domain. So he was getting himself worked up, and then this 59-year-old man walked over to the then 47-ish-year-old Rand Paul's house while Rand was blowing leaves, and surprise attacked him and kicked the shit out of him. Rand Paul had some, I wouldn't say major injuries, but they weren't minor either. I think he had a broken bone or two. And anyway, it was a wake-up call to him. And since then, since this one weird incident where this neighbor got pissed off and harbored a grudge over leaves, Rand Paul has become afraid of humanity as a whole, and because of that, he will not face people who talk to him on the streets. He cowers behind others at this point in a way where he is literally cowering like a puppy, putting its tail between its legs and hiding behind its owner's legs. Okay? There are videos of him being confronted where people aren't threatening him in any way, but just asking him a question, and then the video gets uploaded by Rand Paul sycophants as Rand Paul gets threatened by violent BLM protesters, and all they did was ask him a question about how he's going to vote. Then I even saw one where he's hiding behind his wife, okay? Rand Paul is, I think he's genuine to a degree, because his stances have enough idiosyncrasies within them that I don't think he's maximizing his potential at rising within the Republican Party and getting donors on his side. That being said, there's a little bit of corruption there, and also the physical cowardice does not inspire anyone. Once you learn that Rand Paul literally cowers in fear before someone who asks him a question on the street, it's really hard to respect him or take him seriously. And I think I'm going to give him a D. I really wanted to give him a C, but the physical cowardice is just, it's just too much. And the only reason I rank him this high is because while he is bad on a lot of key issues, especially issues that matter to me, he does have principles of a sort which I think proves that there's some genuineness there. And obviously, even in an ideal world or semi-ideal world, a lot of senators will have some fairly major flaws. But the cowardice just, he's either got to grow some balls or he's going to have to become more principled, something or the other, because this is just, he's just too pathetic. I don't respect the guy anymore at this point. Whenever I hear Rand Paul, I always laugh a little. Just the name makes me laugh at this point. Now we move on to the congressional representatives from the state of Kentucky in the 1st District, which is right here, western part of the state, then along the southern border with Tennessee, and up like this. So Paducah is probably the biggest town in the region. Madisonville and Hopkinsville. But Paducah is probably the biggest, at least to the best of my knowledge. It elects as its Representative James Comer. He is a 48-year-old Republican. He was born and raised in the state of Tennessee and then moved to Kentucky. He served in the Kentucky House from 2000 to 2012. He was then Agricultural Commissioner in 2012. And he managed to raise an astounding amount of money in that office, which shows that he already was tapping into the corporate donos. Comer is fairly well connected, and he, for his race as Ag Commissioner, managed to raise $600,000. His opponent was only able to raise $200,000. As I've mentioned, Kentucky is not a super rich state, and so you can see that there are some very powerful people who are willing to throw some money behind this dude. And in state politics, it's pretty rare for out-of-state interest, or at least it was until pretty recently, for out-of-state interest to really take an interest in agricultural commissioners and stuff like that. Once in office, however, he did show some degree of public responsibility. He teamed with the Democratic auditor at the time to investigate the misdeeds of his Republican predecessor and undid some acts of corruption. So kudos for that. And he also pushed for hemp growing in Kentucky while still Ag Commissioner. He ran in the Republican primary for governor but lost out to Matt Bevin. And this was actually a pretty heated, nasty race. He only conceded at the last minute. So actually, it's interesting with a lot of Republicans now. I think because a lot of people became awakened to this with Trump in 2016 and 2020. But actually, it's become a very common thing in the Republican Party to claim that elections are fraudulent just automatically if things are close and you think you can win on a recount. It almost never happens, but pretty much any time that the thing comes close, you can count on the Republican candidates, even in a Republican primary, to bandy about the possibility of fraud and try to get a recount. And the difference between them and the Democrats on that is that Democrats will often ask for a recount, but typically don't say, oh, it was clearly rigged. And usually the recount will show that the count was off by like 4 out of 28,738, you know. So if it's close enough, I guess it's worth a shot. But there's no reason to go and say, oh, well, I lost. It must clearly be fraud. Maybe 8 more people like your opponent. And then just call for a recount because it's close enough. And then it turns out maybe 6 more people actually liked you. But if not, accept the results and move the fuck on. So anyway, Comer, once he got into Congress, ended up being surprisingly interesting in a way. He still pushes for hemp growing in Kentucky and nationwide, so he is a little bit more open to the Mary Jane than most, and also to one of the few crops that actually grows in Kentucky where the soil is not that great. So in that sense, he actually is helping represent the farmers of Western Kentucky, who otherwise mostly grow soy. So, respect on that. He also is against the embargo of Cuba. So he is more reasonable on that issue than most. And he wants to alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people. So, again, kudos on that. He helped to co-sponsor a Hemp Farming Act of 2018, which was signed into law by Donald Trump. So he actually has passed a bill. Quite a few representatives that we'll look at either have been very productive or haven't done jack shit. Comer is relatively new-ish by the standards of the House, so, you know, at least he's done one major thing, so good on him. And it actually benefited his district. That's pretty important. He also teamed with Oregon Democratic Representative Suzanne Bonamici to fund school lunches during COVID, and that bill also passed, and of course it was important for poor families across the country. So that was actually James Comer, a relatively unknown guy from rural Western Kentucky who helped to make that happen. When we look at his donors, however, we can see that although he does do some good work for his constituents, there are also areas on the national level where he helps to really participate in things which make the country worse and which also are conducive to the ongoing legitimacy crisis. His top donor is the McCarthy Strategic Solutions firm. He also gets money from a lobbying firm. Well, actually, that is the lobbying firm. He also gets a lot of money from real estate and a Minnesota-based sugar company, which I believe is called American Crystal Sugar or something like that. And I'm not sure why this Minnesota-based company spends so much money in Kentucky, but there's another Republican rep who also gets money from them, who we'll talk about. He also gets a lot of money from the Republican Bluegrass Committee, which is a group that raises money for Republicans in this area. So there's that. No, wait, no, yeah, that's what he gets money for. Sorry. Okay. So, oh wait, no, the Republican Bluegrass Committee, excuse me, they do give money to Comer, and what they do is they want Medicare funding to cover some of the meds that they make. That's their angle. That's why they give money to Comer. So on the issue of healthcare, especially on pharmaceuticals, Comer is very much helping to perpetuate high prices and the existing lack of coverage that people suffer under. So Comer, he's a tough one to rate. I think I will be generous and go with the C, however, because he at least represents his district. I think that a healthy system could potentially sustain people like Comer who don't really do anything good on the national level, but who actually do represent their constituents, the kind of local yokel types. I think that there is a place for them, that they aren't necessarily while they don't help on the national level, at least by representing their district to some extent, they help to produce some level of legitimacy. So I can see why people in his district might like him and want to re-elect him. For us outside of the district, however, this guy does suck, just to be clear. Anyway, that is James Comer. Next up, we go to the 2nd District of Kentucky, which is located sort of in the west central region of Kentucky. Owensburg, Bowling Green, which is also the hometown of Rand Paul, are the two biggest areas here, but both of those are fairly small towns, all things considered. And this area is represented by a 57-year-old Republican named Brett Guthrie. Guthrie, of course, like many Republican figures in Kentucky, is not actually born in Kentucky. He was born in Florence, Alabama. He represents a district which also includes Fort Knox, the famous place where, at least at one point, a lot of gold was stored, and where James Bond once had to foil a heist by a bunch of ladies who were models / acrobats / exhibition pilots. So Brett Guthrie has experience in the Kentucky Senate. He attended West Point and he served 4 years in the 101st Airborne Division. He then got out in 1990 and got his Master's of Public and Private Management from Yale. He moved back to Kentucky and won an open seat in 2008, a seat that he has held ever since. In 2008, things were fairly even in Kentucky. At least it was a fairly winnable election in most places, although Republicans were at an advantage because, again, Kentucky is a fairly racist place, and there was legitimate white lash against Barack Obama, and Brett Guthrie, as a social conservative, was able to tap into that and win a seat from the Democratic incumbent, a seat which he has held ever since. After 2008 and then 2010, there was some redistricting, and at that point, Guthrie's district became safer. This also occurred when Kentucky was becoming a little redder, and also the district was redrawn to be a little more favorable. So now the district is pretty consistently 65-35, and Guthrie will hold the seat indefinitely. But his first victory in 2008 was only by 15,000 votes. So he's come a long way. Now he wins by 60 or 70,000, and his opponents never crack 100K, while he always at least hits 150K. So his races are now extremely boring and not really worth following. Guthrie is somewhat boring, and he is a very typical Republican in many ways. He has an A from the NRA, a D from the group that judges how good politicians are on marijuana issues, and D is pretty much the standard score for every Republican, so nothing stands out there. He has a 0% from Human Rights Campaign. Again, he's a social conservative, no surprise. Chamber of Commerce, 92%, pretty typical, I guess. But one thing that is interesting about Brett, despite not really having any stances that are interesting or any major policy positions that one can really name, Brett Guthrie actually has been one of the most successful congressmen in terms of passing bills and amendments. Brett Guthrie has actually passed 11 bills and amendments as a primary sponsor, which is more than, again, most of his colleagues. So Guthrie has passed things on topics ranging from funding for finding missing children, to reauthorizing the FAA, to Alzheimer's research, to slowing down the reduction of Medicare benefits for people who can't do electronic confirmation. There was a Trump bill that mandated that people would have their benefits cut back if they couldn't electronically confirm some stuff. Guthrie actually opposed that, so he actually has a little bit of independent-mindedness, which is good, and also rare in an era where it seems like every Republican is falling all over himself or herself to try to suck up to Trump as hard as possible. He also had a bill or amendment to help make ceiling fans safer, which is pretty obscure, but it's interesting. I mean, I think that could be one of those sort of low-key helpful things. I mean, maybe there's one less freak feeling ceiling fan accident. I mean, that's not a bad thing. Small, but again, I'm okay with that kind of a little reform being enacted. Little tweak. He also he passed something, or an amendment once called the Fighting Online Harm Act as part of the 2020 COVID bill, But what this is it mandates that the FTC has to conduct a study on AI. So it's basically pork barrel spending, and I assume that he must have a friend who does AI research. So that is a fairly rare instance of pork barrel in today's world, where that kind of pork barrel is pretty rare. But in Kentucky, the culture still very much favors good old boys. So Guthrie is just trying to fit in, and as we'll see, maybe he's trying to imitate one of his long-serving colleagues. He had another bill that authorized the Secretary of HUD to crush counterfeit therapeutic devices. And it was co-sponsored by Eliot Engel, who's a Democrat from New York, and another Republican. To translate what that means, basically, it was to help a medical company protect their copyright. So once again, you have a Republican who's corporate-friendly, who acted just like corporate-friendly Democrat Eliot Engel to protect the bottom line of healthcare companies rather than the health care of American citizens. So Brett Guthrie is very much a go-along-to-get-along kind of guy. He has a little bit of independent-mindedness. He does have the ability to be a petty reformer, and he might actually be a guy who might get tapped in the future by a Republican president that heads some sort of agency and enact some minor reforms. He actually seems like someone who might be good at that. Clearly, he knows how to get shit passed, and also he is interested in some things that are relatively minor, such as ceiling fans. So he might actually have a bright future heading a random regulatory agency, where he might actually shine. As things stand, however, while I respect his interest in some minor improvements around the edges, the fact is that he doesn't really do that much of interest for his district, and he perpetuates everything that helps keep his people impoverished, shoeless, and toothless. So I have to give Brett Guthrie an E. Unlike Rand Paul, he doesn't really do things that might have a broader impact and really improve people's lives in a material sense. Except, again, for the one person over a 28-year span who might not die in a ceiling fan accident. So, yeah, use your obvious legislative abilities for good, Brett. Go run some administrative agency. Next up, we have the only Democrat who serves Kentucky in Congress. You won't be surprised to learn that he represents the 3rd District, which is basically just Louisville and part of Jefferson County, which is pretty much all Louisville. That is one Mr. John Yarmouth. I always, for whatever reason, think his name is Don Yarmouth, but it is definitely John Yarmouth. He has served in this district since 2007, and interestingly enough, he was elected with that 2006 Democratic wave, and unlike most of his colleagues who were known for being pragmatic centrist handpicked by Rahm Emanuel to be sort of Bill Clinton-style Democrats, John Yarmouth at the time was one of the more progressive people who got elected. Since being elected, he sort of held the line of where he is politically, and because of that, he's now more center-left than left, although he has been pushed left in the last few years by public pressure. Yarmouth was known as sort of a local journalist. He published a newspaper called the Louisville Eccentric Observer. He started it in 1990 and then sold it in 2003. The columns that he used to publish were pretty progressive, probably more progressive than he's been as a legislator, if we're being completely honest about it. His early elections were pretty close, but because of redistricting, Louisville became more concentrated, and now he wins over 60% pretty easily. Louisville is the bluest part of Kentucky, but because it's still Kentucky, it isn't as blue as you might expect for a city that size. By comparison, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Columbus, Ohio are about the same size as Louisville, and both of them are way bluer. And both of them, all three of these cities are about at the 750,000 people mark, and usually once you reach that mark, the city is pretty solidly blue. Louisville, again, the culture there is pretty blue, but there are a number of Republicans who live there and participated pretty openly in the Tea Party movement, something that you would not really have seen in comparable cities such as Columbus or Charlotte. So just keep that in mind. In the 2008 primary, Yarmouth was one of the earliest endorsers of Barack Obama. He also has been an advocate of removing dark money from politics for years. Although, as I frequently remind people, dark money is only the tip of the iceberg. You need to really remove as much money as possible. We had the problem of money in politics before Citizens United. That has been an issue since the late 70s. All Citizens United did was make the problem worse. It did not create it or really fundamentally change all that much. So, yeah, dark money is almost at this point a red herring. He introduced the American Rescue Act of 2021. So he is the primary sponsor of the COVID relief bill passed by Biden, or at least one of the primary sponsors. Currently, he's also the chairman of the Budget Committee, meaning that in some ways he has been tapped to be the equivalent of Bernie Sanders in the House. He is someone that the establishment is trying to court and appease because it is apparent that people who are a little bit more aligned with John Yarmouth are now coming into their own. Yarmouth, by the way, is not really affiliated with the Squad. He is in the Progressive Caucus, and he's one of the people who probably does belong there, but he is not as progressive as someone like AOC or Nina Turner, who's in the primary fight right now, or someone of that nature, better known progressive. But he is more progressive than most Democrats. It is pretty clear. Most of his money comes from public unions, industrial unions, and for that reason, he has normally been a fairly reliable progressive vote on most issues. One area where he was weak is on Medicare for All, something that he was not for. He was only for a public option for years. But DSA, which is strong in Louisville, was finally able to pressure him into endorsing Medicare for All. I think it was only in 2019 or 2020. So he is a pretty lukewarm supporter, but at least he did put his signature on the page, so it shows that he can be pushed. When it comes to student debt relief, he's another guy that people approach thinking that he would be an ally, but he has been very lukewarm on the issue. He seems to have very little interest in wiping the slate clean or doing a relief of a set amount of money. Say Biden talked about $10,000 at one point or $50,000. Yarmouth is very reluctant to do that, so it's odd that he's actually more conservative than Biden on that issue. One of his ideas is to reduce the interest rate on student loans to 0%, which is better than nothing, but clearly it does not address the crisis or the reason why costs are so high to begin with. So, John Yarmouth is an interesting figure. I think it's interesting, especially how he came to prominence. The times have kind of left him behind a bit. He's 73 years old. Also, the other donation source that he gets a lot of tort lawyers giving him money. So he is someone who is for people getting compensated when they're injured by big companies, which is actually more important than it sounds. And in a country where you have Republicans always talking about tort reform, and also Democrats who are more than willing to play ball with corporations and defend them when they do wrong, that's way more important than it sounds. So, I find Yarmouth a little frustrating because of his stances on student debt and Medicare for All. That being said, he does seem genuine. These do seem like the reservations of an old man whose political views formed back in the 80s or 90s and haven't really been subject to change or challenge in a long time. And I guess he also maybe feels a little out of place because the country's moved left on a number of issues, whereas he used to identify himself as left, but now he genuinely has been displaced in a way by the country moving. So, it's interesting. Yarmouth is legitimate enough, I guess. He doesn't make me think that he's fake. His struggles with issues seem legitimate enough. That being said, he also seems like over time he's sort of just become he's starting to become a generic Democrat in a way. I think he's a B. A B trending towards a C. So, those are my thoughts on John Yarmouth. Now back to the Republicans of Kentucky, so the majority party in the state. We have three more. We'll start with Representative Thomas Massie. So, Thomas Massie is known as Mr. No, which is a lot less cool than Dr. No. But he didn't get a doctorate, so that's on him. And he's known as Mr. No because he, more than almost anyone else in Congress, has developed a reputation for voting against literally everything. And that not only includes everything the Democrats want to do, but pretty much everything the Republicans want to do. This guy is against everything. Massie was born in West Virginia, but spent most of his childhood in Kentucky. He then attended MIT with his high school sweetheart. They got married. He started a tech startup in Massachusetts. He sold it for $32 million and moved home. He then became the judge executive of Lewis County. And in 2012, he was elected in the 4th District as a Tea Party candidate. So I guess a lot of people don't know this, but Kentucky was pro-Tea Party enough that the Tea Party actually had something of a second wave. And Thomas Massie was the chief representative of that. And if anything, despite the fact that he was in that second wave that people tend to forget about, Thomas Massie, you could argue, is actually the purest Tea Partier in the entire country. And by the way, I noticed early on that the Tea Party was especially appealing to Gen X libertarian types, and Thomas Massie falls directly into that demographic. He is currently 50 years old. So at the time of his election, he would have been 41 or 42. So he's basically the poster child for the Tea Party movement. And especially as someone in the tech industry, there are a lot of libertarians there. And as someone who made it easily and made a fortune, he tends to underestimate the struggles that people have. And we see that in the lack of empathy that he shows as a congressman, which we'll get into. If I had to summarize who Thomas Massie is to someone who might not know him, imagine Rand Paul. And imagine some of the occasional asshole things that Rand Paul does. For instance, Rand Paul recently went on the floor of the Senate to try to denounce one of his Republican colleagues from Louisiana who was asking for hurricane relief money since a lot of people on the coast are still struggling. And basically Rand Paul says, no, we have a debt and deficit, deal with your own problems, go fuck yourself. So it sounded heartless and cruel. And given that he was worried about a $28 trillion debt, turning someone from a poor state down for $1 billion is really goddamn petty. And for the most part, Rand Paul doesn't do that many asshole things. But he does once in a while. Thomas Massie is kind of like just the asshole parts of Rand Paul. That's the best way to think about him. His district, by the way, is the 4th District, which I believe is northern Kentucky, so represents Covington. This area has a fair amount of money in it, and so it makes sense that he is an entitled, uptight prick who really has no sympathy for others. That's how he gets away with this. Anywhere else in the state, he might actually get voted out. I have to say that of every person I've studied so far, and I doubt he'll be surpassed in this regard, Thomas Massie has been on the losing side of more lopsided votes than pretty much anyone else in Congress, maybe in the history of Congress. And when he chooses hills to die on, he chooses some very lonely hills, and often those hills make no sense. So, in 2013, Congress passed the Stolen Valor Act, which made it illegal to pose as a veteran in order to gain military benefits. Not military benefits so much as military discounts. So, most people think that this is a fine piece of legislation. It's hard to argue against it. Either you don't really care that much about somebody getting 10% off at Starbucks, or you find it to be an outrage. So really, there's no reason to oppose it. But for whatever reason, Thomas Massie did. And he voted against it. He was the only guy who did. Or actually, no, the bill passed 390 to 3. So Thomas Massie was in the 3. Later on, there was a bill or a resolution which voted to name Israel an ally strategically. But Thomas Massie said, I'm against that because I know that when we give Israel funding, they will use it to subsidize their green energy industry, and I don't even vote for that here, so I'm damn sure not voting for it for another country. I have no idea if he's even right about that. I feel like most of the money we give Israel goes straight to their military, but maybe they give like $10,000 to green energy. I don't know. Anyway, Thomas Massie was able to convince exactly 0 people to go along with him, and he was outvoted 410 to 1. And I have a lot of problems with Israel as an ally. The way they treat the Palestinians is horrible. But to say that they're not a strategic ally because they might potentially spend money on green energy, that makes no sense. That's exactly as stupid as opposing Mitch McConnell because you think he might secretly be gay. I mean, this shit is mind-numbingly stupid. Okay, what's another great Thomas Massie moment? In 2017, he produced a 1-page bill to abolish the Department of Education. So a grandstand, because no bill that passes is ever 1 page. He also served as a co-sponsor for a 2017 bill to abolish the EPA. Thankfully, neither of those bills passed. One good thing that he did was that when al-Assad was accused of the chemical attacks in Syria, and that was being used as a justification for potential intervention, Massie was one of the people who raised the question of whether Assad actually did it. Unfortunately, because Massie is someone with 0 credibility after so many idiotic stands, no one took him seriously. And now there's more evidence in the last few months that actually Assad maybe didn't do it. So had he not undermined his credibility completely before that by taking stands which make no sense, maybe Thomas Massie could have helped national discourse. He also is largely against sanctions on foreign foes, which I think we do too many sanctions often, and that causing suffering for citizens that is not sufficient to really change the minds of regimes just breeds anti-American sentiment. So in general, I think that we should be much more cautious with sanctions and make sure that they are more targeted and also more meaningful when we actually enact them. One thing that he voted, again, kind of like Rand Paul, who I assume is his hero on some level, Thomas Massie tends to be hypocritical on certain issues. So, right before voting for the Trump tax cuts, he said that he is a deficit hawk and he's against the debt, and he will oppose any new spending on principle. And then he voted for the Trump tax cuts, which of course expand the debt and deficit by reducing revenue. And if you think about it, massive tax cuts effectively are a spending measure because it's sort of a stimulus designed for corporations and the wealthy. So, once again, there are no true libertarians. The libertarians are people who kind of have some principles, and those principles sway in the wind depending on what's going on at the moment. One thing that he did that was actually interesting, another thing, is that he was one of 14 Republicans who voted to override the Trump veto of the emergency that he declared on the southern border. Massie pointed out that it is unconstitutional, or at least that it's irregular, to try to claim an emergency where there's not an immediately pressing need. So, interesting fellow. Actually, Massie is, according to the Conservative Review as of January 2019, he is the most conservative person in American politics. Number 1 out of everyone. So if Massie was going for being the most conservative person in American politics, he achieved that goal. So I guess congratulations. I imagine for him this was the goal. He also has had some weird exchanges with John Kerry, former presidential candidate, former Secretary of State. There was a hearing during the Trump years where I don't know what Kerry was testifying about, but Massie went after him in a very public way, and he critiqued Kerry's decision to get a political science degree when he was an undergrad, saying that Kerry had a degree in pseudoscience. And then he also said that Kerry's belief on climate change were pseudoscientific and tried to imply that it's because Kerry had majored in political science. Massey, of course, it goes without saying, is a climate change denier, as are most Republicans. Kerry literally had a what the fuck moment on C-SPAN. It's one of the few times where Kerry actually shined. It was handed to him by Thomas Massey being an abrasive moron. And normally, as most of you know, I'm not a big John Kerry fan. I think that he's got about as much charisma and life in him as Frankenstein's monster. But that's one exchange where he actually looked pretty good. He was the only Republican out of 17 House members who voted against the Israeli boycott bill. The bill that said that it was illegal and jailable to try to boycott Israeli products in order to make a political statement. So he was the only Republican there who had some principle for free speech. Massey is complex, to say the least. Oh, there's something else he did here. Okay. During the early days of COVID, when the Congress was trying to pass a COVID relief bill, they were going to try to do remote voting to try to protect their mostly extremely elderly members from COVID. But on March 27th of 2020, Massey famously went on the floor of the House and demanded that they vote in person, or otherwise he would file some motion which would render the entire process null and void. And this would have also screwed over the Senate bill that already passed. So he took a lot of flack from everyone. Trump actually wanted to kick him out of the party. John Kerry attacked him again and said that he tested positive as an asshole, which again is probably the only good witticism of Kerry's life. And it's only because he really hates Thomas Massey. Anyway, Massey got his way. Congress had to reconvene. And he then did some grandstanding. He claimed that he was standing up for the American people because congressmen should have to do their work and they should have to earn their pay. In general, I'm sympathetic to that, but given the circumstances, a bending of a procedure, which is mostly for show anyway, it's not a constitutional crisis. He was trying to say that if we allow Congress to vote without being in the room, that the Republic will die. I mean, good lord. Talk about being melodramatic. For fuck's sake. Then, it turns out, at least in my opinion, the reason why he did all that is because he wanted to kill the bill, because later on he voted against the part of it which put $320 billion into the Paycheck Protection Plan, which helped employers not fire people and continue to pay them for months. And it was something that really helped a lot of people get through the lockdown. But Thomas Massey wasn't having that because he thought it was something for nothing. Because, of course, the man is wealthy and he made it easily, so he assumes, again, everyone else can do that without any problem. So, if he can do it with his wealthy family and MIT education, then somebody in Kentucky who lives in a shack and didn't graduate high school can also do it, goddammit. They just got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and stop whining. Do a tech startup like Thomas Massey, you lazy fucks. Thomas Massey has some principles. Those principles, unfortunately, really fuck over his constituents. Also with the EPA, because Kentucky has some residual damage due to their old coal mining industry and people like Matt Bevin in the past, Steve Beshear, a lack of general environmental protection. They do need a good EPA, so trying to do it, the EPA really screws over Kentuckians. Massey, he's a guy who I can't give him an F because he seems genuine. I mean, he's a real-life eccentric. He kind of does what he does because he believes it, so that can't be an F. But he's still an E, just because he does damage to the interests of the people of his home state and his district. He makes everyone look like an asshole. But he's legit, in the sense that, I mean, he's an asshole. He's not doing this for political theater necessarily, except with the COVID thing, but he probably does believe the Republic will fall, and that he is a hero standing on a rock with his cape blowing in the wind and his hair dramatically blowing in the wind. The sun shining on his face. The people cheering him and thanking him for his principled stand. This lonely stand that posterity will recognize. And one day, statues of him will be in every square in America. Every liberty-loving square, that is. Next up is one of the most corrupt members of Congress. I'm actually surprised at how prominent some Kentuckians are in Congress. This is Representative Harold Hal Rogers. He's an 83-year-old from Barrier, Kentucky. He was first elected along with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and he is the longest-serving Kentucky Republican in history. He attended Western Kentucky University, then he got his law degree at UK. He has served in both the Kentucky and the North Carolina Army National Guard. I don't know how that's possible, but that's what I saw. He is actually from an area which is one of the few areas in Kentucky which was safely Republican even when the rest of the state was blue. Just like East Tennessee, there were a lot of Unionists in Eastern Kentucky, and so because of that, this area has been Republican forever, really since the inception of the Republican Party, literally. So Hal Rogers, you might think, because of his long-term status as a Republican, might have had something to do with the reddening of the state. Nothing of the sort. He was the product of the area and took advantage of existing trends. That being said, Hal Rogers is a pretty cagey, old-school good boy politician. He is the master of pork. In fact, he has been labeled as the Prince of Pork. And back when there were a lot of exposés about pork being put into bills before that became uncommon, he really featured in a whole lot of editorials and studies between about 2005 and 2007. He became almost a household name for a minute, at least among people who keep up with government accountability. Hal Rogers also had a moment of prominence in the 90s. He was actually one of Bill Clinton's favorite Republicans. Bill Clinton famously won Kentucky both times and loved to visit the state. And he made friends with a number of Kentucky lawmakers, including Hal Rogers, who often helped Bill Clinton get stuff done. Hal Rogers is the kind of guy who, if you grease his palm with a little bit of pork or a campaign contribution, he can be a swing vote. He's very flexible. And Bill Clinton figured that out early. And since Bill Clinton's bills were mostly fairly conservative anyway, it was not a hard sell. And Hal Rogers was one of the Republicans who helped Bill Clinton remain capable of passing bills even after Newt Gingrich took control. He also helped to found a 501c3, which is sort of a tax-exempt nonprofit called the Center for Rural Development in 1996. The point of this is to, of course, help develop rural areas, and most of his district is, in fact, rural. London, Kentucky, which you see on the map, is basically a nothing town. I guess it must be the biggest city there, but not much to it. Also, an interesting thing about Hal is that you might wonder what happened to Hal after pork became harder to acquire. I mean, when pork was going strong in the early 2000s, Hal actually got a water park named after him in his district because the people who owned it really loved him. They thought he was great. He got them a bunch of money. And he kept doing pork, especially in the War on Terror. He would get Defense Department funds spent on random shit in his district as a part of him getting money. Needless to say, this started to piss people off, both as the public mood turned against pork and also as Republicans became deadly serious about national defense and giving money to the biggest contractors rather than to local yokels in eastern Kentucky. So Hal Rogers started to hold out his palm. He went to the defense contractors and he said, all right, if you want me to serve you instead of local powers that be, get out your checkbooks. I can't do pork anymore, but you got to give me something pork-wise. That's why people keep voting for my sorry ass. And also, I'm going to need some campaign contributions. So, what we see is that he goes from being somebody who gets hit on national defense from both left and right for being soft and for being corrupt, to being someone who now carries water shamelessly for defense contractors. So, let's see who the top donors are. He gets money from Progeny Systems, which helps develop electronic systems for the Department of Defense. He also gets money from Primary Care Center, a healthcare company. American Crystal Sugar, an out-of-state sugar company from Minnesota. The American Bankers Association. The Appalachian Recovery Center, which I guess is not too surprising and also not corrupt. And of course, the rest are pretty much all various defense contractors and lobbyists. They figured out that if you want him to act like a typical Republican on defense, you gotta grease the palm. So that's what they eventually learned to do. I think there were efforts at a time to try to get primary challenges against him, but Hal Rogers will be in that seat till he dies. He has a lot of deep connections in the district. In terms of how well he actually represents his district, I guess that's fairly debatable. Eastern Kentucky is the poorest part of the state. As I mentioned, coal mining there is effectively dead, but that's what people are clinging on to. They're clinging on to the hope of those jobs coming back. They're not. And people have not really moved on. Hazard, Kentucky, which is in this district, is one of the poorest places in the entire country. It's so desperately poor that at places like University of Kentucky, they try to recruit teachers and they offer them a bunch of benefits and extra pay to go there. And it's understood that you can't really stay there for long because the place is fucking miserable. There have also been efforts to build a University of Kentucky branch out in Hazard to be a local stimulus. But Hal Rogers, I don't think he's been all that active on a lot of those fronts. He has gotten some pork barrel into his district, but that has mostly just gone to fairly well-connected people who have water parks and goofy shit like that. It's won him enough popularity to win re-election, but his district remains poor. And since he got elected in 1980, largely due to trends beyond Hal's control, his district has gotten poorer, but he has not stood up against things like outsourcing. He's not stood up for job training or free college or a lot of the things that might actually help alleviate the poverty in his area. He also has not really been strong on, say, food stamps or other things which potentially could help people where he lives. So, despite the fact that people like Hal Rogers, he still sucks and he has worked against the interest of his people by and large. Not to mention that on a national level, he is literally a poster child for corruption, known outside of his district and state. So, when people think about Washington, they think about people exactly like Hal Rogers, who get useless pork barrel projects for their district and don't really take issues seriously enough. For that reason, Hal Rogers has to be enough. He's less of enough than McConnell, but that's largely because he's less well known. Last and arguably least, we have someone who might be about as bad as Mitch McConnell. The representative from the 6th District, centered around Lexington and Frankfort, Republican Andy Barr. His real name is actually Garland, but he always goes by Andy. And here's the district in pink. I remember Andy Barr all too well because he ran in 2010 and then ran and won in 2012 when I lived there. Andy Barr is currently 47 years old. He is a Lexington native from a well-entrenched family. Lexington, despite being a mecca for rural gay people who go there for refuge and acceptance, also has a lot of old money families, many of whom are either local lawyer dynasties or else are horse people. And Andy Barr is from one of those families. He was Lexington native, as I mentioned. He then attended the University of Virginia, and while there got involved in Republican politics. He used to write articles for his classmates about Bill Clinton being a draft dodger. So he was attending college between about 93 and 96 or 7. I'm sure that all of the Gen X kids he went to college with were very concerned with whether Boomer Bill Clinton dodged a draft or not. I'm sure that was a top tier concern for them. He must have been ultra popular, gotten invited to all the parties, and gotten laid constantly. Anyway, Andy Barr earned a BA in government and politics. He was a legislative aide to John Talent of Missouri, from 96 to 98. He went back to Kentucky, and in 2001, he earned his law degree from University of Kentucky in Lexington. His specialty was protecting businesses from liability suits. So literally being a corporate whore in the purest sense, and protecting corporations from people. So, really wonderful man. His colleague at one of his law firms, or at least someone who worked in the same field, was Democrat Steve Beshear, who was himself embarking on a political career. As I mentioned, despite being the father of the current governor, who is a reasonably solid-ish Democrat, Steve Beshear is basically a Republican who just runs as a Democrat. And it was actually Steve Beshear who had the bright idea that Andy should get involved in politics. Apparently they had a lot in common politically, which says all you need to know about either one of them, since both of them are fucking horrible. Andy Barr got involved as a lawyer working in the Fletcher administration. Fletcher was a Republican governor before Steve Beshear. He managed to stay out of the scandals which really racked the Fletcher administration and led to Beshear's election. And despite being a close friend of Beshear, at least somewhat of an ally, he did continue to batter Beshear's allies once he was running for Congress. In 2010, he mounted the challenge to incumbent Congressman Ben Chandler, who only had the job because his father, Happy Chandler, that's his legal name, by the way, Happy Chandler. I know it's a stupid name, but that was his name. Was sort of a local legend in the 6th District. Ben was actually able to hang on in 2010, despite, of course, the Republicans really cleaning up in a historic fashion across the country. And what was really interesting about that is a lot of pundits said that the 6th District of Kentucky would be a bellwether, and the Republicans would either gain their great victory or not, depending on how the 6th District went. But in the event, the Republicans won huge, but the 6th District held for Democrats. So, as a bellwether, it ended up changing. However, in 2012, Barr came back for a rematch with Chandler. The district had been redrawn slightly, and with that slight edge, with slightly more Republicans in the district, Andy Barr was able to squeak out a victory. And after that, his victories have become much bigger. Although, to be fair, in 2018, he had a close call against Amy McGrath. She ran and was able to come close. She only lost but 51 to 48. Of course, Amy McGrath famously lost in 2020 to Mitch McConnell. Her specialty is mounting challenges that don't go anywhere, but she gave some false positives as a candidate by coming close against Barr. But, of course, close is no cigar. And of all the districts we talked about, the only one outside of the 3rd that Democrats can possibly win is the 6th District. So if you can't oust Andy Barr, then you're not that great of a candidate, if we're being completely honest about it. Andy Barr is, to put it simply, the biggest corporate whore in Kentucky not named Mitch McConnell. He is openly an errand boy for Wall Street. Lexington, as I mentioned, has a lot of banks in it, so Lexington bankers love this guy. The horse aristocracy loves this guy. And he just does the bidding of wealthy people and is fairly open about it. There's not a lot of subtlety to Andy Barr. He will sometimes beat the drum for social conservatism, but it's all a very thin smokescreen for being a corporate cocksucker. Andy Barr gets his money from Prudential Financial. He also gets money from Apollo something management. I wrote all this in very small handwriting. He also gets money from Alliance Resource Partners. He gets money from Charles Schwab Corporation, Golden Tree Asset Management. And mostly the other donors are in the insurance and real estate industries. So yes, Andy Barr represents only the rich and powerful. If you're a landowner in this area, Andy Barr's your guy. If you're a landlord, he's your guy. If you're a big horse racing fanatic with a bunch of money, Andy Barr's your guy. If you're a banker, Barr's your guy. If you're a Wall Street banker looking to donate to someone who will always have your back and screw over the common man in every turn, Andy Barr is your guy. Andy Barr is a complete piece of shit. He's a disgrace to this country. He's a disgrace to Lexington, Kentucky. He's a disgrace to everyone who's ever had to see his stupid fucking face, and he's an F. He makes the country worse, and in so doing, worsens the legitimacy crisis. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, he is only 47, and he is unlikely to die soon. So, I leave you on that depressing thought. Andy Barr will be with us for a while. That's all I have for you. Next time, we'll cover the so-called corporate state Delaware, a state which is simultaneously almost 100% blue and almost 100% corporate and corrupt. We'll see if it's as bad as Wyoming, or maybe it's a little more like Kentucky, where there's some people who are kind of mixed bags. I guess we'll find out in the future. Until then, I'm Spirit of Thersites, kicking ass, taking names, and handing out official certificates of shame. Good night.